Hi, everyone. How are you? It is Thursday, April 30th, and waiting to make sure this is going. Okay, it's going. And we are here a wee bit late again to discuss chapters 3 and 4 of The Body Keeps the Score. And I just so appreciate your grace in the large window that 4-ish has become. So, I'm hopeful that some of you are seeing me pop on and you'll pop on and watch. If not, watch the playback anytime. All right, so these two chapters were full of things, and many of you sent in quotes and questions. So I'm grateful for that. So we're going to try to overview a little bit and then read, hey, Amy, some of the quotes and questions that you sent in. And some of you, especially Diane, really tried to read this book in light of what's happening right now, which I thought was a really helpful practice. And she poses, hey, Lisa, some good questions for us. So we'll dig into those. All right. So the body keeps the score. Here we go. So chapter 3 was much shorter than chapter 4. And I found that I read through that really quickly and I was like, oh, this is good. And then I get to 4 and I slowed way down because there was just so much to digest. So chapter 3 is about the brain. The whole thing is really about the brain, but it's looking into the neuroscience revolution. So, so he starts talking about scans and how when they initially began to study people's brains by having people go over their traumas and explain their traumas and basically relive their traumas while they looked at brain imagery of what was happening, how that kind of opened up a whole new world to them. So pretty much people would share their flashbacks and their nightmares, which is amazing to me. But he shows, so these two chapters are full of diagrams. So hopefully if you have the book, you spent some time looking at those, but this isn't the best picture, but he basically shows like tons of pictures of the brain and what parts of them light up normally and when trauma is being relived. So he talks about well, actually, I meant to start with the trigger warning. Sorry. So if you haven't read the chapters yet and you're coming to this now, if you're particularly sensitive to trauma as it relates to a few things, one, the death of a child, the loss of a pregnancy, or car accidents, then you should probably skip these two chapters. So I just want to put that out there for us. So those are a couple things. Let me make sure I'm watching your comments. Oh, hey, and there's Diane. All right, so he talks about trauma being pre-verbal. So basically, people who've been through trauma cannot articulate what they're feeling. They just can't articulate things verbally. It's more of a physical body response. So he says that it doesn't mean that they can't eventually open up about their trauma, but initially that's not something that's going to happen. And there goes my door. I knew I'd have a child coming in. Hey, mommy needs a few minutes, okay? Thank you. Thank you, honey. Love. Anyway, so it's hard to articulate trauma. So he talks a lot about that, and he talks about the sides of the brain, so, which I found interesting because you have your right brain and your left brain. And he says that your right and left brain, right? So your right brain is the first one to develop in the womb. It carries all your nonverbal communications. It's the first thing that works, the crying, for hunger, for I pooped, I peed, I have needs. And then that is also where memories of touch, sound, smell, you can come here, emotions and things like that come into play. And it senses, this is Elfie, say hi to mommy's friends.
Hi.
Hi. It senses intuitive truth. So that is what happens on the right side. But the left side of the brain is it's the other stuff. It does all the talking. It is that's just. Are you making faces at everybody and distracting mommy? Thanks. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. All right. So anyway, basically, your left side is logical, rational. It's the one that does all of those things, whereas the right side is artistic, emotional, that kind of thing. But when you experience trauma, the left side of the brain shuts down. And normally, even though we say people are left-sided and right-sided, really your left and right side are always communicating. But when you're in trauma, your executive functioning stops. So your left side doesn't work. Your basic executive functioning stops. And so you're no longer able to do those logical things. Thank you, LV. And Diane highlighted a bunch of stuff from these 2 pages that talk about the brain and talk about the left and right side working together until trauma, when the left side is deactivated. And so that explains why when you've experienced trauma, you really can't necessarily use language to explain what happened logically. You're only able to express what you feel. Can you go back in the other room with your sister? Yeah, go do that for me. Thank you. Can you close the door? You're hungry. We're going to eat very soon, okay? We'll talk about being hungry too in these chapters. Oh, thanks, Amy. So, and then he talks about fight or flight and how when your stress hormones are activated because of trauma, you're constantly in this active, stimulated firing of things. So normally when you would experience something, and this might be getting a little bit more into chapter 4 than 3, but he says that normally when something traumatic happens to you, this is probably a good transition into the next chapter. Usually when something really traumatic happens to you, if you're able to move away from it, if your body is able to fight or flight, right? When you can do one of those 2 things, which is your evolutionary, I guess, response, because your brain's most basic need, your brain's most basic function that he gets into in chapter 4 is to protect you and keep you safe and to make sure that you have what you need. So when something traumatic happens to you, your brain responds by telling you to run or to fight. And so as long as you're able to do that, then your brain, the firing eventually stops and your brain can sort of reset to an extent or return to normal. Maybe. But if you are experiencing a trauma that you cannot get out of because you're being held down, you're being trapped, either actually physically trapped, or maybe you're a child who lives in a household where you're trapped by nature of you're a kid living in a house with caretakers or parents and you can't leave because you can't provide for yourself. So if any of those things happen, then your brain isn't really able to reset and it just continues to fire constantly. So he says that when your stress hormones are continually elevated, you can't, this is where memory problems come in. This is where elevated irritability, sleep disorders come in, and a lot of long-term health issues. You're really hungry right now. Why don't you get a pear and rinse it off? Okay. Go rinse it off for a few seconds and eat a pear or an apple. Okay. Can you have it up here? You're not really supposed to have it up here. If you don't make a mess, you can have it up here. Don't make a mess. Okay, bye. This is what has happened all day. Mommy tries to do something and I can do it. Well, I can sit with him and be quiet all day, but then if I try to do something I need to do, I'm just very needed by everybody, including a million text messages. I wonder if that's what life is like for you right now. Probably is. So anyway, being constantly stressed from trauma and having these parts of our brains lit up um, causes a lot of health problems. It causes a lot of sleep problems. It causes irritability. It can cause, he talks about later on, autoimmune diseases to flare, and lots of things can happen. And then executive functioning doesn't work. I keep going back to that because I keep thinking about children that I used to work with who had executive functioning problems. And it really makes me keep going back to, for some of us, executive functioning is just a problem. It just is, like we all have our things that we deal with, and you can work through therapy and things to get that up to speed. But I've also worked with other kids whose um, family life wasn't fantastic, and I knew that. And they seem to have a lot of executive functioning problems. And I'd never connected those two things. And this book makes me think or wonder that there may be some connection there. So, all right. So, yeah, so Diane, I think I tried to hit a lot on some of the things that you highlighted in quotes that you liked in chapter 3, but he kind of ends with something that Diane highlighted that I did too. And he says, I'm continually impressed by how difficult it is for people who've gone through the unspeakable to convey the essence of their experience. It's so much easier for them to talk about what's been done to them, to tell a story of victimization and revenge, than to notice, feel, and put into words the reality of their internal experience. And yeah, that I've experienced that to be true with people in my life who have experienced trauma, and even some of my own trauma. It's just so much easier to tell the story of what happened to me instead of this is how it makes me feel, and this is how I can kind of see outside of that and move past it. So for this reason, and this is a question I had before moving on to chapter 4, he talks about how for some people who are so hypersensitized to their past, such as the woman that he shares the case study of, the woman who was in that terrible car accident and lost both of her children, had a really hard time reading that. Detached telling, yes. That he says that for her, because she could never move past that and she could never stop feeling that and reliving that and racing through all of that with her body, that he felt like a treatment for her that would desensitize her to that trauma and to kind of break the cycle would be best for her. And he says that this way her biological responses might be muted so that she could realize and remember that that was the past and this is now, instead of reliving that experience over and over and over and over again. And he says he'll talk about that later in the book. But I found myself wondering a lot more about desensitization. I can't say that word. Because I've always been taught, well, maybe not always, but in my adult life and in my ministry.
Can I have a trash can? You don't.
Yes, you may use mommy's trash can. Here you go. Thank you for saying excuse me. But I've always approached feelings as important, like feel them, live them, talk through them. But maybe there are times when that's not appropriate because it takes you somewhere where you don't want to go. So I think that would be an interesting thing to talk about. Like, at what point do you decide in therapy or in working with people that perhaps the retelling is just too much, it's too dangerous, it's too highly sensitized, it's making everything respond and fire too much. So I'd love to hear what you think about that. All right. Next part of the book, part 2, is This Is Your Brain on Trauma. Kind of makes me think of when I was a kid and this is your brain on drugs. He talks about the anatomy of survival, and this is where he gets into the different parts of the brain, which I found really, really interesting. And let's see, who one of you was talking about Rhonda, you were talking about the different parts of the brain and how in all of your studies you've studied this, but he kind of lays it out there in a way that's easy to understand.
Did I get off the sticker?
You got off the sticker. Good job. Okay. Can you go in there with your sister? Thank you. But he talks about the brain and he puts it into three main parts. And he talks about going from the bottom to the top. So you have the reptilian brain, which is the oldest part of our brain. It's our basic needs, to eat, to sleep, to poop, to do all those things. And that is most basic. That keeps us safe. It keeps us alive. Then he goes up from there to the limbic system, which is he calls our mammal brain because it's what makes us mammals, right? Like we have emotions, we care for one another, all of that stuff happens there. And then the top, the neocortex, which is, he says, we're distinguished from other mammals because it's thicker. So the function of it is much more complex. So he gets into that and explains that's where your frontal lobes are. And then he starts to talk about the system that shares signals. So we can talk about that a little bit. But he sets this whole chapter up to talk about the brain by sharing a story, a traumatic story of a little boy who watched 9/11 happen. He was a first grader. He looked out his window. It wasn't that far away, but he ran and he was able to get to his parents. And because that fight or flight worked, he was able to process his trauma. And the way his brain allowed him to process that trauma was he drew this picture later and he made meaning of what had happened by drawing a picture of 9/11 happening with a trampoline at the bottom, saying if there had only been a trampoline there, fewer people would have died. They would have been safe. And that was how his brain made meaning and processed and kind of sorted through the trauma. But he said, again, when you can't lean into that fight or flight, you can't resolve it in that way. One thing that stood out a lot to me in this chapter, I always go to the children and caretakers part. That's the part of all this that resonates with me the most because I've been a teacher, I have children. Some of my own trauma that I've had to deal with is related to growing up as a child. So he talks about how children will take their cues from their parents. And he said, as long as their parents or their caretakers are calm and continue to meet the needs of the children, then children can survive even the most terrible things without serious scars. And I think that speaks to us now because we're all talking about living through this time of collective trauma. And we're living through a trauma, and the way our children see us as caretakers responding to it is important. It's really important. So the way that we're responding to the news, the way that we're responding to schooling, which I'm going to tell you, I haven't responded well there. The way that we're responding to juggling so many things, the way that we're responding to being inside, the way we're responding to being asked to go outside. All of those things, the way we respond to all of those things is important. And recognizing that we're firing all the time and trying really hard to be careful about our response and trying to be really careful about making sure that our kids' needs are met. They are fed, they are sleeping, they are getting all the things that they need. That's going to help them to come out of this much more okay and much less scarred than if those things weren't in place. So if we're reacting poorly and we're not attending to the most basic needs, those reptilian needs even, and then those emotional needs and going up from there in the brain, if we don't meet those needs, then our children are not going to be okay. All right. So Rhonda says, as a therapist, it makes much more sense to me that some therapies work for some people and not for others. this is based on what parts of their brains are offline. Exactly. He talks a ton about when parts of your brain shut off. And I'm actually going to shut this door, coming right back. They're watching a movie. And what I learned in this chapter is that when your brain is functioning rationally and correctly, you can tune things out and focus on what you need to focus on. I was starting to have trouble focusing. Okay, where was I? I loved that in this chapter, as he explains the brain and the way that it responds, and he talks about the scans and things of your different parts of your brain. He has a case study of a couple that was in a car accident, the exact same car accident. They were in the same car. They experienced exactly the same thing, but the way they responded to it and the way their brain scans showed up was completely different. And part of the reason for that was the way that they had learned to respond to trauma. So the first thing they do is both of them just like deal with it by drinking too much, which is how they just decide to deal with the immediate effects of the trauma. But then when they go in and they have these scans done, what they find is that the Stan, the husband, he is responding with these bodily experiences where his heart is racing and he's feeling all these things and he's replaying the tape over and over again. What could I have done different? And that's how he responds. And so he can't get past that. That's that whole, one side of the brain has taken over thing. His body has taken over. So that's what happens with him. But his wife just shuts down. And when you look at her brain scans, whereas his are firing everywhere, she just has, I think, like this one or two little dots down at the bottom and everything's blank because she froze. She completely froze. They had to pull her out of the car and she was just like a deer in headlights. And he says that there are a couple of different ways that you can respond to trauma. He responds in one way, she responds in the other. And she responds by freezing and not being able to remember much of any of it, blanking out, because she had learned that behavior as a child. Her mother used to scream at her. And so she learned to shut down because if she could blank out and shut down, she wouldn't feel it, she wouldn't experience it, she wouldn't remember it. And he says that even though initially it seems that having the nightmares and having the sweats and having the racing heart seems worse, that there's something to work with in therapy there. There's a memory to go back to, and that you can help those folks to progress. But in some cases, he feels like it may actually be harder to work with someone who's just shut down because they've kind of like, they blanked out. So that was pretty interesting. So going back to the brain, we're organized to survive. We have our, different parts of the brain. And let's see, I'm trying to find. And he spends most of his time talking about what's happening in the prefrontal cortex and how that is what teaches us to be social creatures. It's what teaches us how to react to others. It's the part of the brain that's developing in toddlers. So, like if I pinch you, you scream. If I show you this, you give me that. If I yell, you get upset. Like these are the things that toddlers learn, like 2 and 3-year-olds learn, and that's what's developing. But that's where your time, your empathy, your understanding, everything happens there. Whereas your emotions are under that, and then your basic needs, your basic chemical, physical needs are under that. All right. I wish that this would pop up better, but he spent a lot of time talking about this. So inside behind your prefrontal cortex, there are all these other things happening. And there are these different parts of your brain that send signals to one another and communicate with one another. And if they communicate and function correctly, then you respond to your world and your environment in a healthy way. But in a time of trauma, the signals get shorter and things just start firing quicker. And so the way you respond to trauma after that um, could be different. So he says that your thalamus is it's like what sends smoke signals to everything, and then your prefrontal cortex is the watchtower. So you're sending, from inside here, you're sending signals saying, fire, 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 smoke, 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 smoke. But your prefrontal cortex can look and kind of have a broader view and say, you know what, I do see smoke, but that's coming from 2 miles away, so I'm safe. Or holy crap, that smoke's coming from the next, from the next room over, I had better run. And he says in traumatized people, that signaling doesn't always work. And so they're not able to understand what that smoke means. So they're constantly maybe on alert. So a couple things can happen. One could be that you're constantly, afraid, or you're desensitized and you've shut down. So those are a couple of things that he talks, and I could go on and on and on because it was really interesting, but I want to dig in more to some of your questions and your thoughts. And Diane asked a couple of questions that I found really fascinating for us. I don't know why my camera is not focused, but she starts reading this through the eyes of the pandemic, which is an excellent thing to do. And two of the things that Diane noticed, one was, I guess in the previous chapter, the author talks about how the way our brain is wired to survive requires that we're living in community in order to get through trauma and process trauma. And so Diane's asking, she asks, how in the world are we supposed to do this right now when we're isolated from one another? He says the most important job of the brain is to ensure our survival. This is on page 55. Even under the most miserable conditions, he explains the things that the brain needs to do for us, like send us signals, show us where to go to meet our needs, give us the energy to do it, warn us of danger, and adjust our actions so that we can get what we need. But he says, since we're social mammals, we can only survive and thrive in groups, and all of these things require collaboration and coordination. So I think the question Diane is asking, and I would throw back at all of you, is how do we do this now? Is this technology that we're on right now, using videos and Zoom and FaceTime, is that enough to keep us connected and collaborating and social? Or is it not quite enough? Is there some cognitive dissonance there? In other words, cognitive dissonance is, you're a little disconnected from what's actually happening. I can see you, but I can't touch you. I can't smell you. I can't hug you. I can't be in the same room with you. So there's a disconnect there. So does that actually keep us from being the social creatures we need to be, or is technology allowing us enough of that we can get through this trauma? I'm curious what you think. All right. And then Diane asks another great question. Yes, Rhonda says the thing that's confusing is we hear we're in danger from an invisible threat and we believe it, but as time wears on, it's harder to process it. Some people have gotten really angry that they can't proceed as normal. Rhonda, thank you, because that goes right into the last point in Diane's question, which is on page 65 in my book. He talks about the balance of systems, the balance of our rational and emotional brain. So kind of that left, right, and then all of the different top-down parts of our brain. When everything is balancing, everything works, we're good. But he says when people feel their survival is at stake or they're seized by rages, longings, fears, desires, they stop listening to the voice of reason, and it makes little sense to argue with them. Whenever the limbic system, and if you remember, the limbic system is you have that's the most basic part of your brain, or second most, right? So that you have your reptilian brain in your limbic, which is where your emotions and all that stuff is. So whenever the limbic system decides that something is a question of life or death, the pathways between the frontal lobes and the limbic system become extremely tenuous, and things may or may not work correctly. And he talks about this horse and rider thing, right? Like the rider can control the horse under normal circumstances unless the horse feels threatened, and then suddenly there's not a lot the rider can do to control where the horse goes. And so Diana is asking, is that what's happening with the people who are saying stay shut down, and then the other people who are protesting and saying open up? Do we even know which one is rational and which one is emotional? We do have this horse and rider moment, and it is a little bit scary because we don't, we're so split over what's safe, is what Diane's saying. We're split between being safe and opening up the country. People are afraid, on one hand, that if the country opens up, that we're all going to die. And then there are others who are afraid that if we don't open up, we're all going to die, but for different reasons. There are people who are afraid of this invisible monster and killing us all with a virus. And then we're afraid that not being able to have jobs and work and have our livelihood, that's going to kill us. And I hear both of those things. And then emotions get involved and everything swirls. Yeah, Rhonda says, I think we have a lot of bad cowboys out there not keeping their horses under control. I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, I can tell you what camp I'm in on this, but yes, people are not keeping their horses under control because the horse has lost control. A good companion, Amy says, a good companion read to this is The Whole Brain Child. Even if you don't have kids, you learn how you've developed the ability to integrate and process events in your life or not. It's a therapeutic read. Yeah, I think that's something a lot of educators have to read, is because it helps you understand kids. At some point, I stopped reading with my highlighter because I was highlighting too much. But I'm just curious, if you haven't chimed in, is there anything else you really liked about this chapter? Are there questions that you had? And how does this relate to the pandemic? How does this help us? Diane says, yeah, which way is the way to go? I'd love to hear what you think. Phyllis sent me she sent me a link that this author has done a video on helping people through the trauma of the pandemic. I haven't had a chance to watch it yet, but it is free. So I'm going to watch it and then I will post it here in the comments. And if it's really awesome, maybe we'll just make a standalone post. But I'll post that for you to watch for yourselves, or whatever. So thanks for listening to me ramble today. And I will try my darndest to be on time next week. So next week, in case you aren't sure, next week we're going to be reading chapters 5 and 6 on Tuesday, which begins with this lovely picture of people snarling. There's a dog snarling and people snarling. And then we'll do chapter 7 and 8 on Thursday. Again, message me, comment wherever with questions and quotes and things like that. Thank you so much for being here. This is really a helpful book. It's hard to read. I don't know about you, but like it's getting my mind going in all kinds of different directions. It's got me thinking about the different ways that people growing up in the same household process things, and what the repercussions are for us as people, maybe who are just interested, people who work with people who are traumatized, ministers, therapists, all of those things. So thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.